Happy New Year to all my viewers. I'd like today to talk about the state of Ukrainian studies in Canada, but specifically an institution, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where I was a senior researcher from 2013 to 2014. And I thought the best way to discuss this question would be divided into five, as it were, segments. The first would be Canadianization. The second is revitalization intellectually. The third would be to transform and become relevant to contemporary Ukraine. The fourth, to modernize and join the 21st century. And the fifth, to use the four previous to counter Russia's information war. Why do we need to look at this question now? Well, we are still reeling from the shambles surrounding the attempt by the University of Alberta to impose the candidacy of David Marples as the director of CIUS without any internal or international competition. And if he had have been appointed as the new director, this would have continued along going back to 1990, 1991, so nearly 3 decades ago, that whereby a non-Ukrainian Canadian would be running CIUS. Let's remember that non-Canadian Ukrainians have been running CIUS far more than Canadians have. And David Marples has lived in Canada a long time, but he's British, he's not Canadian. He's also not the historian of Ukraine, he's a historian of the Soviet Union, and he has perspectives on issues which are not really in line with the majority of the Ukrainian community in Canada, which provides funding for CIUS and provides support for CIUS. And these are issues such as David Marples' attack on the decommunization laws adopted in 2015. He actually organized the open letter against them. And also his belief that Soviet crimes are not as bad as Nazi crimes. So there are many issues surrounding him which would not have been favorable to the community, and that's why his candidacy provoked such a strong rebuttal from many people. But a final point is that you cannot lecture Ukraine about its abuses of office amongst oligarchs and high-ranking politicians when we ourselves don't practice what we preach. And there was an example of nepotism surrounding the attempt to get this position. David Marples was seeking to have his wife hired at the same time as himself. And that didn't sink well with many people. I know that from various emails I received at the time. Ukrainian studies in Canada has stagnated, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, I'll call it CIUS from now on, is an example of that. This is very dismaying, and I'll tell you why. Because when I lived in Britain and I was an undergrad and graduate student in the 1980s, CIUS was my beacon for anything to do with Ukraine. I would then be writing on a regular basis, there was no internet in those days, to Bogdan Kravchenko, the director, and he would be engaging with me and sending me lots of texts, and I would be subscribing. I don't know how many people subscribed in Britain to the Journal of Ukrainian Studies, but it was the place to go for anything to do with Ukrainian studies. That is not the case today. Poland, and I'm not exaggerating, today Poland has more experts on Ukraine and publishes more on Ukraine, including contemporary Ukraine, than Canada. In fact, if you look at the 4 big Western countries that publish on Ukraine, Poland, Britain, US, and Canada, Canada's at the bottom of that list. Another point is that CIUS, because of the nature of who's in charge and the stagnation of the institution, pushes away its leading scholars. An example here is not only myself, but Serhy Plokhy, who left University of Alberta to work as the Hrushevsky Chair of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, and who probably on his very own publishes more than the entire CIUS put together. Final point is, where are the Canadian Ukrainian or CIUS equivalents of Anne Applebaum and Timothy Snyder? Where are they? Two Americans who have done more for Ukrainian studies in the last 10, 15 years than anything that CIUS has done in Canada. And they not only because of their publishing work, but both of them are what I would call public intellectuals, and they go out into the wider world, policy-making communities. For example, Timothy Snyder last year gave an excellent speech to the German Parliament, the Bundestag, and they write op-eds, they write blogs. They are engaging and they're acting and they're working against Russia's information war. Nobody at CIUS is doing that. So, again, that's very sad, because people like Bogdan Kravchenko, if there had been the internet and social media in the 1980s, would have surely been more like Timothy Snyder and Applebaum than the current leaders of CIUS. Let me get to the 5 points or 5 steps. The first one, the need to Canadianize CIUS. It's as though CIUS was the wrong title for the academic institution for the last 25 or so years. Maybe it should have been called the American Institute of Ukrainian Studies, because American Ukrainians have been heading CIUS for the majority of CIUS's existence. Only the first 2 directors, Professor Lupul and Professor Kravchenko, were actually Canadian Ukrainians. And this has consequences in a number of areas. At a recent 40th anniversary of the foundation of CIUS held in Edmonton, which I attended, Professor Lupul complained about this Americanization of the leadership of Ukrainian studies in Canada. It's not only in CIUS. Orest Subtelny, Professor Magocsi, and others are also American Ukrainians. Professor Lupul complained that because of this, the whole question of research on Ukrainian Canadian history and Ukrainian Canadians' contribution to the development of multiculturalism in Canada had been practically ignored by CIUS. Of course, this is an area that's of interest to Canadian Ukrainians, but not to American Ukrainians who have been running CIUS. Another factor is that CIUS, after 1991, when Ukraine became an independent state, never broadened its remit, its research remit, to include politics and international relations. In fact, over nearly 3 decades of Ukrainian independence, CIUS has only published 1 book on Ukrainian politics. 1 book. Ihor Bardyn admitted to me recently that there are simply no funds available in Canada for Ukrainian political studies because the funds are already monopolized or allocated to other subject areas. And all of this in turn has led to stagnation in Ukrainian studies, and is the reason why the new director of CIUS should not be a Brit, should not be an American, it should be a Canadian. And with the new employment legislation that exists, which did not exist in the past, surely that is a requirement on the university to ask first if there is a required or a candidate that's suitable for the position who lives and is in there before they go internationally. The second point, to revitalize intellectually. What do I mean by this? CIUS needs, and Ukrainian Studies in Canada needs, new scholarly blood, both from Canada, the US, and also from Ukraine. There are many good young Ukrainian scholars. Many of them have done PhDs in the West. One interesting aspect of the way Ukrainian Studies has managed to sort of develop is that the study of Ukrainian history is dominated by men. If you think about it, try to think of a woman who's a historian of Ukraine in the West. I don't know, they're all men. There is no gender balance, which is a big issue today in Canadian and American politics. In political science, on the other hand, there is a gender balance. Countless articles about the Euromaidan, about the war, about Ukrainian politics are written by a new generation of up-and-coming women political scientists. So that could be another factor which could influence who would be the next director. It's time to be more with the new trend in employment hiring, and maybe also aim for a greater number of women involved in Ukrainian studies, in particular Ukrainian history. There is a requirement for those who are continuing to monopolize positions to maybe, say, retire. Because in their refusal to leave, they are part and parcel of the problem of stagnation in Ukrainian studies. And the reason why intellectually CIUS is not the powerhouse, the go-to place that it used to be in the 1980s and maybe a bit later, but certainly not today. It's not the institution that publishes books like Bloodlands, Red Famine, On Tyranny, and many others, which are published by people like Snyder, Applebaum, and others. There's really only one scholar of some kind of international stature in Canada involved in Ukraine studies, and that's Paul Robert Magocsi. Thirdly, transform and become relevant to contemporary Ukraine and today's students. I believe that it's time to recognize, and this obviously was not the case in the 1970s when Montreal was still the dominant city of Canada, and it was just the beginning of the process of everything moving to Toronto and Toronto developing in the last 40 years as the preeminent city of Canada. CIUS today should be equally divided between Edmonton and Toronto. Toronto office is a place where you have currently 4 members of staff. I believe that most of those are close to retirement, or maybe should maybe go into retirement. Toronto's CIUS office, if it was expanded and if there was a new approach, could become an incredibly good center for the study of modern Ukraine. But that's not going to happen with the current people who are there. And if such a center was created at the CIUS Toronto, that Center for the Study of Modern Ukraine could interact with policymakers in Ottawa, with Canada's media players, and both electronic, like CTV, CBC, and media, Globe and Mail, National Post, are all based in Toronto. Toronto is the media capital of Canada. And also interact with academia. The preeminent think tank of international relations in Canada is the Munk Centre, which is just up the road from CIUS Toronto. That's not happened at the moment, but that could happen if there was a perestroika of CIUS. The result would be a massive increase in student numbers in Ukrainian studies. When I came to Canada in 2001, I launched classes at the University of Toronto on contemporary Ukrainian politics, and I had 15 to 20 students. When I taught in Washington at George Washington University on Ukrainian politics, I had 15 graduates in a class, or up to 30 undergraduates in an undergraduate class. You're not going to be able to become relevant to students and to Ukrainian Canadians and even a broader group of people if you continue down the path of what is today currently Ukrainian studies. You need to have different approach. You need to make it more relevant. And that's clearly the case when even Marko Stech, who works at the Toronto CIUS office, admitted very recently in a speech that Ukrainian studies cannot even attract 2 students at York University to do language and other courses. 2 students. He estimates there are 1,000 students with Ukrainian descent at York University, and not even 2 of them sign up for courses.
I have depended on non-Ukrainian students for my enrollments. In the university, which has over 1,000 Ukrainians among the students and over 300 in the Ukrainian student club, and I cannot get 2 of them to attend the Ukrainian Studies course.
That surely is a reflection of stagnation of Ukrainian studies. And it's not just in Toronto. It's also in Edmonton, where classes on Ukrainian language instruction have been closed or have already closed. The next question is to modernize and join the 21st century. The older generation in Ukrainian studies simply are not in tune with modern ways of doing various things such as social media and electronic media. At the panel I just talked about on the 40th anniversary of CIUS in Edmonton, I was the chairperson, the discussant. And of the 4 speakers on the panel, only 2 of them even used email. None of them, of course, used social media. So what can we even talk about? If they're not using even email, what can we talk about the whole question of social media? Obviously, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube are simply beyond those who are currently running CIUS and Ukrainian studies in Canada. When you take a look even, for example, at the Wikipedia page of CIUS, you will see that it was written very hastily or very quickly, or nobody took much notice of it. It's actually less than 1 page on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a go-to place for many people to find information. And yet even things like that are not taken very seriously. If there is new blood and retirement of current people, then there will be an increase, an interest in using social media like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and blogs, op-eds, and such like. But until that happens, it will not be the case. We need to use the 4 previous steps to counter Russia's information war. It's interesting that when Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and CIUS were created in the 1970s, that one of the reasons they were created was to counter pro-Russian bias that they felt existed in academia in the West, particularly in the history department, and also bias coming from the Soviet Union. So then Russia's or Soviet disinformation war. Today, CIUS and Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute simply are not doing their job when it comes to countering Russia's information war. How can they when they're not even using social media? They were different, if they were revitalized, if they were transformed, they could cooperate with policymakers, think tanks, the Ukrainian community to counter Russia's information war. But as it is, that's not happening at the moment. And that clearly was seen in the campaign against Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister, but originating in Russia, accusing her and her family of having links to the Nazis. Anybody that countered that was really from individual members of the community, people like, for example, Oksana Bashuk-Hepburn, but it wasn't a sustained campaign, and often academics currently in Ukrainian studies will usually put their heads in the sand when it comes to delicate issues such as World War II, Ukrainian-Polish relations, and the Holocaust. I'd like to just conclude by saying Ukrainian studies in Canada has been in an era of stagnation for too long, using the phrase from the Soviet description of the Brezhnev era. The era of stagnation should end. Canada and Ukrainian studies in Canada used to be the go-to place. It can become that again, but it only can become that if it changes, transforms, and has a revitalization, re-energization of its personnel. Until that happens, Ukrainian studies will continue to be unattractive to students and unattractive and unable to deal with policymakers or to counter Russia's information war. And that will be a disservice both to the Ukrainian community, to the founders of CIUS, and to Ukraine, which is now in the midst of fighting a war for its survival against Russian aggression. Thank you, and again, Happy New Year.